Good morning and welcome to the next in our series of the Kauffman FastTrac author series. My name is Alana Mueller. I'm the president of Kauffman FastTrac. Please join me this morning in welcoming Philip Delves Broughton. Philip is the author of two best-selling books, Ahead of the Curve, 2 years at Harvard Business School, and The Art of the Sale, Learning from the Masters About the Business of Life. From 1994 to 2004, he worked for the Daily Telegraph of London as a reporter and foreign correspondent based in New York and Paris. He then left journalism to get his MBA at Harvard Business School. He has since worked on leadership development at Apple, is a senior fellow here at the Kauffman Foundation, and writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times. It's my pleasure to welcome Philip Delves Broughton.
Thanks very much, Alana. Can you hear me? Is that all right?
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone, for attending this. So I'd like to talk about three things today in the time we have, 45 minutes we have. And they are who makes a successful salesperson, the importance of storytelling and dealing with rejection. I'll talk for 45 minutes, and then there'll be 15 minutes for questions. And my contact email is at the bottom there if any of you have any further questions. So I'd like to start with a quote from a very famous advertising executive, David Ogilvy, who founded Ogilvy and Mather, one of the biggest agencies in the world, who said this thing, "We sell or else." And Peter Drucker, the great management writer, used to say that only two things matter in business, which are sales and innovation. We make something and we sell it, and the rest is detail. This matters even more to an entrepreneur, someone who's running their own business, even than it does someone running a big company. Because selling is something you cannot farm out to others when you run a small business, your own business. You need to learn how to do it yourself, however uncomfortable it makes you feel, however little you like to do it. And there are a lot of people who love to develop a product, love the idea of running a business, but when you ask them to sell, it's something they have real challenges with. But selling is what puts you in direct contact with your revenue. It puts you in direct contact with your customers, which allows you to improve your product and service. It's absolutely invaluable, and everyone has to find a way to do it if you plan on setting up a business. So I wrote this book, The Art of the Sale, because I believe there's nothing in business matters quite so much as selling. I think it's the most important aspect of business. But I went and got my MBA at Harvard Business School, and there was no sales course. We studied finance, we studied strategy, marketing, operations, almost anything but selling. And I found that a lot of people who were very smart in all kinds of ways, very smart about business in many kinds of ways, avoided learning about selling because they found it terrifying. And in many ways, they're right to be scared. Sales involves a very high degree of emotional exposure, a very high risk of rejection. It's very hard work. There's a lot of meetings that don't go so well, a lot of rejection you have to deal with. You can't hide behind a PowerPoint or a 5-year strategic plan when you're a salesperson. Your numbers really speak for themselves. So my belief is that nothing interesting in life or in business happens without selling. Cars sit on the lot, medicines go undeveloped, and books don't get published. And one of the interesting things I found about selling is, to many people it seems easy. It almost seems like a profession that, the smarter you are, the more accomplished you are, the less you want to be a salesperson. It's not something that has the status of a lot of other jobs in business. And yet we also know how hard it is. So I read a lot of the books about selling, and I found a lot of them made it out that all you need to do was sort of show up in time, keep a lot of lists, keep your appointments, have a nice suit, have a clean car. And I didn't find this very convincing because it didn't seem to get to what was really hard about selling, which is persistence, the willingness to stick at it, the willingness to take information that may be uncomfortable to listen to and use it to improve your product or your service. So I wanted to try and normalize sales for myself and for anyone in business who's kind of scared of it and who find that when they try to learn about it, find it oversimplified, or they would rather sort of shove it to the margins. And so that's what my intention was in writing this book. So what I tried to do was break down selling and make it into more modular pieces to kind of understand it in smaller pieces rather than this big, intimidating subject. And this is one way to start. There are many ways you can do this. This is one way I chose to look at three aspects of a sale. The first piece is the economic piece. How much does your product or service cost? What is your customer going to get for that price? It's an economic discussion around value. The second piece is a structural piece, which is the process of a sale. Is this a sale that can happen very quickly, in a minute, or is it a sale that's going to take 18 months and it's going to involve going to different people in an organization, lining people up, getting them all aligned, finally getting a check months after you started the process. So what's the process that's going to have to be gone through to get a sale made? And the third piece is this psychological piece, this battle of wits that goes on between a salesperson and their customer. And this ranges from things like, your ability to persuade, your charm, your ability to read the customer, understand perhaps what he or she isn't telling you as much as what he or she is. And that's a third piece to this. And I think each of them are well worth thinking about very separately. Perhaps some of you have seen this man. He is called Tony Sullivan, and he's one of the top infomercial pitchmen and producers of infomercials in the country. His business partner for many years was a guy called Billy Mays, who had a beard and was famous for shouting at the viewers on television. And any entrepreneur can learn a lot from watching Tony pitch. He grew up in rural England, so I'm very proud of him. He lives now in Tampa, Florida. His father ran a successful business renting slot machines to pubs. And the reason I want to talk about him was because whenever I asked people, describe to me the perfect salesperson, it was often someone like Tony that they came up with, someone who's very charming, sort of loud, a great storyteller, a little bit in your face. And part of what I did with my book was go around and interview all kinds of different salespeople, and I found there are many different kinds. But Tony, in many ways, is the sort of archetype, the kind of person we think of when we think of a sort of classic salesman. As I said, his father rented gaming machines to pubs, and from the age of 4, he'd accompany his father on his rounds to meet these kind of pub landlords, these bar landlords. And his father, he says, was a terrific salesman, a storyteller, who would tell him that in life and in business, he should never let anyone tell you no. This is something, again, you hear again and again from salespeople. Never take no for an answer. Your goal is always to turn that no into a yes. Today, Tony runs a thriving business doing his infomercials, and he lives just down the road from Derek Jeter on Davis Island in Tampa. And his father's lessons and this experience of selling from a very, very early age have served him extremely well financially. He's your classic salesperson. He's done very well in a very classic form of sales. He told me the first sale he recalled closing on was on his parents' house, and he was just 9 years old. And the estate agent, the realtor, came round with these prospective buyers, and his parents went in. And it was left to the young Tony to show them around. And he took them up and showed them the attic where he liked to play, in the garden, all these kinds of things. And when his parents came back, the realtor went up to his parents and said, you know what, your 9-year-old son sold your house for you. And the reason was that it turned out this couple had children of their own. And so when they saw an excited 9-year-old telling them all about how wonderful this house was, it was the best sales pitch they could have received, because they got an idea in their head that this could be a house that they could raise their children in very, very happily. When Tony was in his teens, his father used to send him out on collection calls to collect money that he was owed. And I remember Tony, he told me this thing. He said his father's secretary said to him, one thing you must never be afraid to do is to ask for what people owe you. Tony said to me he still thinks of that every day. One of the things I discovered writing the book was many really successful salespeople have experience early in their career of debt collecting, repossessing cars, collecting long overdue debts, accounts payables, because that experience of going and getting money is a huge part of selling. People often think about selling as pitching and making a seductive pitch and winning people over with what you have. But a big part of selling, and I'm going to talk about this later, is actually getting the money. And so Tony's experience of colorful storytellers, but also actually getting money out of people when perhaps they've been, very slow in paying or they didn't want to pay, was a vital experience for him. And I'm going to come back to this, but I think it's well worth thinking about. It's not just pitching and good storytelling, it's also getting money and being willing to get into that uncomfortable position of asking for what you're owed and not being afraid of that. Tony began selling in local markets around England. First it was just T-shirts, and he would stand behind a table waiting for people to come. But at some point he realized that that isn't real selling. Having a great product and service, putting it out there, and thinking people are going to see the value in that is not selling. What selling is actually pitching, demonstrating your product, winning over an audience with a story, demonstrating and proving your value. Tony believes, and he told me this, is that sales is a natural talent. He said to me, I have people who work with me who know everything about sales, but they still couldn't sell. They don't have what it takes. And then he says he's watched kids on YouTube who make fake infomercials, and they're getting millions of views. He told me he'd read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and he'd attended a Tony Robbins convention, but ultimately he found them pretty superficial. And here's what he said. He said, they get you all fired up, but you fall back into your old ways pretty soon. When you get into a bar fight, you revert to what comes naturally, the old-fashioned tactics. Neil Rackham, who wrote a very famous book called Spin Selling, said something very similar. He said, most people who go on sales courses have forgotten everything they learned within 30 days. I hope you don't forget what I'm going to tell you today within 30 days, but I think that's the truth. And I think the reason this happens is because by the time people are adults, their behaviors are pretty much formed. So sales courses or conventions that get you all hyped up and tell you you can be different run into the reality of people's habits, well-formed psychological patterns. When you ask 5 people to identify the characteristics of the perfect salesperson, what I found is you might start with someone like Sullivan, but then you'll get very, very different answers. They'll start coming out. I interviewed the head of an equity sales team at a major bank who told me when he interviews people, he always asks the same question, and it's this: if I were to give you a $100,000 bonus today, what would you do with it? The wrong answer was to say you'd put half in your 401k and use the rest to pay down your mortgage. The right answer was you'd go out and blow the lot on a Porsche, fast car. Because this sales manager, he wanted employees who really wanted to make ever more money, who needed to make more money. You know, other sales managers have told me their ideal salesperson is a middle-aged woman who's divorced with young children, who just has that equal need to make money, to pay the bills. So they're not going to be squeamish about asking for money that's owed to them. They're not going to be squeamish about picking up the phone in the way that a sort of tortured Generation Y employee might be. They'll be incredibly tenacious and very determined on your behalf. A senior manager at a big business process outsourcing firm said to me that when he hires salespeople, what he's looking for is people with low egos who regard client service as their highest goal. So he doesn't want people who go in and dominate the room with a big shiny suit and a jangly Rolex watch. They want people who can make others feel comfortable, who are articulate and who can deal with the unexpected. He says it doesn't care if his salespeople can talk about wine with a CEO or baseball with other salespeople. He wants salespeople who know their product and their business really well and can link it to a client's needs, and that's it. All these other sort of personality traits we think we seek and want in a salesperson were irrelevant. I interviewed a professor at MIT, a guy called Howard Anderson, who had a very successful career running a consulting business and venture capital firm. And he told me that what he wanted in salespeople were ex-athletes from first-rate schools who were the first generation in their family to go to college. So these were guys who tend to be very competitive, very responsive to financial incentives. And he said if you put a group of salesmen together and ask them to rank each other in terms of competence, if you don't have a fist fight, you have a problem. So again, a very different kind of salesperson, not the low ego kind. They wanted business process outsourcing, but a highly competitive ex-college jock type. So the question is, who's right? A lot of people think we know what we need out of a salesperson, but you're getting all these very different types who are appropriate to very different businesses, very different settings. So as an entrepreneur, as someone setting up your own business, the question is not I need a sales type. It's like I need the sales type who is right for my business, who is right for my service and product, because there is no generic type. So in 1961, there was a very famous article published in the Harvard Business Review by Robert McMurray, who was an industrial psychologist, and it was called The Mystique of Super Salesmanship. And McMurray made this point that even the very best salespeople are hard-pressed to explain why they can do what they do. So he, rather like I have, I'm trying to break things down, trying to break sales down into sort of smaller, more comprehensible pieces. I'm sorry, this is rather awry, this slide, but it's a translation from Keynote to PowerPoint. But he tried to make sales into these various kinds. So at the bottom you have delivery, so people just delivering, postmen, UPS people who just come to your door and give you something. You just want to smile out of them in a pleasant manner. And up at the top you have intangibles. So these people who sell concepts, so advertising executives or people in investment banks who are selling ideas of buying and selling a company, people who haven't yet created a product or service, but are perhaps pitching for money because you want people to believe that you are the person who can make this dream a reality. As I show up here, the two arrows on either side show that the higher up you go here, there's more uncertainty, And in conventional professions, you actually get paid more because you're thought to require more skill. The challenge for the entrepreneur and someone starting their own business is you're up at the top here. You're selling, if you're lucky, a tangible. You actually have something to show people, a product that works in a certain way. Or you may even be selling an intangible. You may be selling a concept, and you want people. So you're essentially doing the very hardest kind of selling, the most uncertain. And yet in that moment when you're doing it, you're not being paid more. You're being paid very little probably, perhaps because you've gone out on a limb. You're living off your savings. So you're doing the hardest kind of selling with the lowest reward at the moment you're doing it, of course with the hope that later you will be rewarded much, much higher. McMurray suggested this thing about salespeople. He said the single most important trait in them is something he called the wooing instinct. And he said the wooer is basically like a seducer, someone who has a real need to win other people over. They actually feel very unloved themselves, unwanted, so they use charm and flattery, even deception, to win others over. A really kind of bad seducer type is the kind of salesperson who does very well under McMurray's construct here. So he thinks that you need to really successful salespeople are these kind of rogues, these kind of rogue seducer types. And I think a lot of the bad impressions people have of salespeople come down to exactly that type. The salesperson who seems to want to win you over with no regard for what your interest is, solely in their own self-interest, and every sale for them is a way of kind of making themselves feel better about themselves. I don't happen to believe this is true, but I think this is a very powerful vision of bad salespeople and has been very prevalent in the sales industry for a long, long time. So that was the wooing instinct. He also laid out these other characteristics of great salespeople. He said they need boundless energy and optimism. You really need to bounce out of bed and, first thing in the morning, ready to go, and you have to be very optimistic because your day will be full of obstacles, of people saying, well, I can't pay you yet, or I don't want it quite like that, meetings getting cancelled. You have to have extraordinary energy and a will to get through this, and an inner motivation for why you want to tolerate all the adversity that comes with selling. Because many times during the day you will wish you had a job in which you just sat at a desk and collected a paycheck and had steady health insurance, rather than going through the agony of going out there and trying to persuade people that what you have is worth paying for. The third thing is this chronic hunger for money. Again, it's not a particularly pleasant trait, but often great salespeople, they want to close, they want to get that sale done because they want to get paid. As I mentioned earlier, it's the person who, when given $100,000, doesn't put in their savings but goes out and buys a Porsche. If you're hiring salespeople, that may be something you want to think about. Again, it's not a very pleasant thing to think about, but you do want people who want to keep going out there and making money. Again, this is McMurray's view. Self-discipline and capacity for hard work. This is very much the kind of Dale Carnegie, how to win friends and influence people view. So sales is essentially about making your lists, keeping well informed, showing up on time for meetings, making those phone calls, going through the 100 calls a day, whatever it is, and being very, very self-disciplined about it, knowing that the vast majority of people may find shortcuts through this very, very hard work. And the fifth thing, again, I'm going to come back to this later, is this ability to see obstacles or rejections as a challenge. Again, they are inevitable. They're inevitable whether you're selling for IBM and Cisco, and they're inevitable when you're setting up your own business. You are going to face endless obstacles. You are going to face rejection, and whether or not you succeed will depend very heavily on how you handle those obstacles and rejections. Do you get beaten down by them? Do you go home and you're unable to lick your wounds and you cannot get out of bed the next morning because this is too brutally hard for you? Or do you take them as fuel for your next day's work? This is vitally important. So in 1964, a few years after McMurray wrote this piece, another article came out by a couple of academics called David Mayer and Herbert Greenberg, and in which they said that salespeople have to have two qualities. And again, what I'm trying to do here is go through all these different visions of what it takes to be a good salesperson and get away from the cliches and all the sort of hardened ideas people think about what it is it takes to be good at sales, and present you with a lot of different ideas of what it really takes. So successful salespeople have these two qualities of empathy and ego drive. So empathy is the ability to listen. Vital in selling, you hear it all the time. Listen, listen, listen. Understand what's in the customer's head. But you also need ego. And the ego is in two pieces. One is you need to be satisfied. You need to enjoy this job because it gives you a sense of self-worth. If you're the kind of person who's out there selling and all you do is hate it, or you don't get real satisfaction from pleasing a customer, you don't kind of have the ego for this work. The other piece of this ego is you need to be a slight bully. Now, again, it goes back to what I was talking about with Anthony Sullivan. You have to be willing to close the sale. You have to be willing, having listened, having empathized, having understood what the customer needs, to say, here's what you need, check please. The empathy allows you to sort of develop the relationship, allows you to improve your product, but at some point you have to be able to reach out, put your hand in their wallet, and take their money. Mayer and Gruberg wrote this, saying that because of the nature of all selling, salespeople will fail more often than they will succeed. So since failure tends to diminish their image of themselves, their egos cannot be so weak that this self-image continues for too long. The failure to sell must be a trigger toward greater effort. And through this success, they will feel better about themselves and their egos will be strengthened. So this is a real challenge in finding good salespeople and determining whether you can sell yourself. Is you need excellent empathizers, people who can listen, but they aren't so empathetic that they can't close. You need people with strong ego needs, but who are still capable of taking that moment to figure out what someone else wants. They've got to be aggressive enough to close, but not so aggressive they put people off. So too much empathy, and you'll be a nice guy finishing last. Too much ego, and you'll be equal kind of a disaster. So empathy is a two-step process. This is where it gets very difficult and very kind of refined. So on the one hand, you need to understand other people. The second piece is then sharing them. So psychopaths, for example, understand other people extraordinarily well. But unlike the rest of us, they're not restrained by sharing what their victims feel. What they do instead is they enjoy causing pain based on the information they've learned. They target the very weaknesses they've perceived. So when you get this wrong, you have a salesman who looks like this. Hannibal Lecter, perfect salesman. Great at one-off sale, great at listening, terrible at relationships. So are we any closer to understanding what makes a good salesperson? I've given you a range of different types, different traits, different characteristics. So in 1985, a famous academic article was published, and what it tried to do was called the determinants of salesperson performance. And it was an attempt to take all the academic, scientific study of salespeople over the course of the 20th century and make sense of it all and say, having looked at all of this, here's what really counts in great salespeople. So they crunched the numbers on all the things that we think matter. You know, one's aptitude for selling, a sort of natural gift, one's skill around certain processes and methods, the level of motivation one has to do the work, and all kinds of other personal factors. You know, are you good looking? Do you have a nice big white smile? Do you come from a certain social class? And what they found was that success in different sales settings depended on very different sets of factors. So motivation, for example, really matters when you're dealing with really long, punishing sales cycles. So if you're selling industrial goods, if you're selling jet engines, if you're selling road products, where the sale can go on for months, not years, motivation really matters. You've got to stay up to do this for months on end. Aptitude, or what we think of as kind of inherent ability, matters when you're selling highly transactional sales. So one-offs, lots of different sales in a day. There's very little prospect of a long-term relationship. And so what matters is this knack for closing sales very quickly. And I'm sure everyone has friends who are just very persuasive, very good at persuading others to do things in very sort of short frame of time. But that only really works in this very transactional sales, very quick, a lot of them. It doesn't work so well in the long, long sales cycles. But more important than motivation or aptitude was this whole range of personal variables, such as age, your sex, your height, your weight, your race, your education, your marital status. So if you're a member of a country club, for example, in theory it might mean you're able to sell high-end real estate because there are lots of members of that club who buy high-end real estate. It gets you access to the customers you might need. Of course, you then need to be the kind of person who can sell to your friends and fellow members, but at least you have that advantage now. You have access to the people you want to sell to. It's often why women make very good sellers of things like engagement rings, because a man buying an engagement ring would rather be sold to by a woman who can put the ring on her finger than being sold to by a man with a hairy fourth finger. In certain settings, certain very specific attributes matter. But what they really found was that across all these different industries and different studies, all kinds of things mattered in different ways to different extents. So the idea of trying to nail down what it really meant to be a successful salesperson was incredibly hard. But here's what they did find, which is that there is one predictor of selling that is more important than any other, and that is something they called role perception. Now, it sounds like a sort of complicated, strange psychological term, but it's really very, very simple. It's about how a salesperson feels about what they do. Do they feel good about it? Is it consistent with their vision of who they are? If it was, if they had a healthy degree of role perception, they tended to do very well. It had the single biggest effect on performance. I wrote a piece about this for the Harvard Business Review blog recently, or earlier this year, and the response was extraordinary. Because people, I think, really see this and they really recognize this in salespeople. If a salesperson knows what they are doing and why, if it's very clear to them what they're being rewarded for, who they need to impress, they thrive. The more ambiguity and conflict which surrounds their jobs, the worse they performed. So, for example, if you're telling your salespeople all the time, the most important thing in our business is to build relationships, and that's the message you're giving them. But then if on the end of each quarter you're pacing the floor saying, where are the quarterly numbers? It forces people into a very confused mindset. Yesterday you were saying it's relationships. Now you're saying I have to close this sale today, possibly at the expense of this relationship, in order to make these quarterly numbers. You're creating confusion. Often people in selling are having to navigate the line between their personal and their professional relationships. Everyone has a very clear idea of where that line is. If you force people to abuse that line, some people will become very upset. Some people don't mind at all. But others really don't like the idea of being forced to sell to their friends, taking personal relationships and making them commercial. It's your job as a sales manager, as a person who hires salespeople, and as a salesperson yourself to figure out where that line is in your mind. When you ask people to do things which are inconsistent with who they are or who they see themselves to be, you're running the risk of really badly affecting how they perceive their work, which is the vital indicator of whether or not they'll succeed. The reason why this matters in sales more than almost any other area of business is because sales most days is such an emotional roller coaster. It depends on people having this good attitude, a good mindset, being willing to take a risk, being able to think intelligently and creatively about how to pitch, and also being able to bounce back from rejection. These are all hard things to do, and if you contaminate that, the good attitude, the good mindset, the ability to think creatively, if you contaminate that by letting people thrash around these issues of how much truth do I tell in order to close a sale, which is more important, the quarterly numbers or the relationship? Why can't I make the sale next week even though it could be registered for the next quarter, because that would actually help relationships. It's your job as the manager of a business to help people get these issues clear in their minds, because if you do, you stand a much greater chance of getting excellent performance out of them. Another thing that Mayer and Greenberg talked about was this notion of inbreeding mediocrity. So if you ignore the importance of role perception and keep on hiring the same old sales types, which is what you see again and again, you get a sales manager and he hires all his or her old friends to sell the same product in the same old way, rather than acknowledging there are very many different kinds of salespeople. But the most important thing is this role perception issue, not whether you've sold a product before or these traits we think make great salespeople. You get this great term, I think, called the inbreeding of mediocrity. You see this again and again and again. Companies hiring the same kinds of people to sell the same product and getting the same results. Mediocrity repeats itself over generations inside a business. So in order to avoid this, I would argue before you hire a salesperson or even go out and sell yourself, you get very specific about what it is you want that person to do or what it is you expect of yourself. Which part of the sale is most important to their job? What's the context? What are the psychological and personality demands of this role? And what kind of person is going to be satisfied by it? It's breaking the sale down into all these different pieces, not looking for a generic salesperson, but breaking your sale down. What is the industry I'm in? Who are my customers? What's the most important aspect of the sale? And then, what is the kind of person who's going to develop real satisfaction from doing this kind of work? The skills can be taught. You hear this again and again. You hire for attitude and train for skill. The attitude, the personality match is most important. The skills can be taught. Changing someone's psychological habits and traits is so much harder than teaching them skills. It's much more expensive, and it's rarely worth the financial investment. So here are some ways to do what I just suggested, breaking down that job, breaking down your sales job into all these different pieces to help you identify and look for the right salesperson. So there's 3 steps of a sale. Again, this is another way to think about sales. Seduction, rationalization, closing. You need to seduce. You need to conjure up an idea in your target's mind, in your customer's mind, of how their life, their business is going to be enhanced by what you are trying to sell them. And seduction is the right term here because it's a kind of, you want to create a great feeling about what it is you have. Then you rationalize. Then you talk about price, you talk about features, you talk about the kind of match between their needs and what you have in a very rational, logical way. And then you close, you get the check. These are 3 very different things, and often what you'll find is people are good at one and maybe not so good at the other. When you're thinking about the kind of sales you need to do, which of these 3 is most important? Are you in a business where the most important thing is closing a lot? Then you need real closers. Are you in a business that's more theoretical, perhaps more intangible right now? In which case you need very powerful seducers who can get out there and take an idea and really make it seem magical in the minds of consumers before you even get to the rationalization point. Which is the most important to you and your business right now? Find a salesperson who is good at that particular thing. Here's another way to think about it. 3 kinds of a sale. The first is task-oriented. So many customers, when they're sold something, they simply want a product or service that gets a particular job done. So you happen to have a garden hose that can water someone's garden. The gardener wants a very simple hose. Price is reasonable. Let's just get this done. The task is achieved with the product you've sold. You move up a little bit. You get buyers who are very self-oriented. They want, and you often see this in commodity products. Everyone is selling the same thing. So what advantage is there to you trying to sell your product versus the next guy or woman coming in with basically an exactly the same product at roughly the same price? Well, the buyer might say something like, let's have lunch. Do you have tickets to the game? It becomes more of a relationship. It's less about the product or service, more about what you can do for the buyer. The third thing is, again, there are many kinds of categories we want to go through, but a third kind of category is the relationship-oriented sale. Some buyers really want to know you over the long haul. Perhaps they're buying a product that's complicated, a service that has a 3-year installation cycle and service and requires updating. If you're buying a complex industrial or engineering product, they want to know that you're going to be able to renew it. They're not going to have to tear their business apart in a few years' time because your product is now outdated. But it could be something as simple as a car service. Someone wants a trustworthy driver who's going to show up on time and treat their customers, their family, whoever it is who's being driven around, safely and decently. It's relationship-orientated as much as it is about, I could get 10 other guys to drive me around, but I like you, I trust you, and that's, again, it's a relationship-oriented sale. And to bear that in mind when you pitch the product is absolutely vital, and also when you pick salespeople to go out and sell this product. What I see again and again being overvalued when people hire salespeople and when they think of themselves as salespeople are these 3 things: experience, contacts, and passion for the product. Experience goes back to what I talked about, the inbreeding of mediocrity. You see people again and again being hired because they've done this kind of sale before. Now, sometimes that matters. Sometimes, yes, it is useful to have done a complex sale before, or even a not complex sale. You know a few of the tricks of the trade. But the truth of the matter is that products are changing so fast, and along with that, skills get outdated. So experience of having sold a product for 10 or 15 years is not so important. Good experience of selling something well is vital, but just experience in and of itself is highly overvalued, and salespeople get hired because they say, I can sell this product because I've sold it before, and it's just not true. Contacts, again, it's not who you know, it's who you can sell to. It's no good knowing all the right people if you're too embarrassed to sell to them for whatever reason it might be. It's no point knowing all the right people who in 2 weeks' time are going to be moving out of the job where they actually buy your product. So people who come to you and say, I've got this wonderful contacts book, it doesn't matter. What matters is who are you going to be able to sell to in a month, in 6 months, in a year's time while you're working for me. It's not your contacts now, it's your contacts in the future. And again, it's not contacts you know, it's contacts you can actually sell to, and there's a big difference. The third thing is passion for the product. You hear this again, time and again. It's vital you're passionate about your product. I think that's total nonsense. What people are passionate about when they sell is often the life as an entrepreneur. They're passionate about getting immersed and getting involved in a particular business environment. That's the passion you have to get involved in, and it's not necessarily the product. What I see being undervalued again and again is optimism. This is the absolutely most vital thing in salespeople, the ability to stay positive when things are going badly. Tenacity, the ability to stick with sales when people are saying no to you, staying on the cold calls, making the 100, playing the odds, vital. And this third piece of context, product and relationships, goes back to what I was saying about role perception. Are you the right person to sell this product to these people? It's absolutely vital. It's no point saying someone's a great salesperson if you take someone who's good at selling used cars and then ask them to sell antique carpets or books. They're two very different products, very different sets of relationships, and there's no earthly reason why one person being good at selling used cars should be good at another kind of selling. So before hiring, ask these things. What's the context? What will this salesperson have to do? What do I really need to pay for? What attitude must they have? Does this job match their self-perception? Absolutely vital. And finally, what skills do they have? It's the last thing on the list. And it's not just in hiring, it's asking you about yourself. As you set up your business, you are going to have to be your main salesperson. And think about this. Which areas can you improve yourself in? What are your areas of strength? What can you do better? And where do you need to bring in outside help? So storytelling, the second part of my talk. When I talked to Tony Sullivan, he said, you say the purpose of a pitch is to put a crowd under the ether, was the phrase he used. And he used to say it's all about, selling is all about telling an irresistible story. Ray Charles, he said, used to say that people like country music because of the stories, and it's the same with products. You want people to be enraptured by what you say. So by the time you ask for the money, there is simply no other answer except, yes, I'd like one. The architecture of a story is very similar to what it is the architecture of a pitch is identical to the architecture of a great Hollywood movie or a great thriller. You have to come up with a sense of crisis in the mind of the buyer. They really need something. There's a problem in their life that is not being solved. There's a struggle to fix this problem in which you, as the salesperson with your product and service, go side by side with your customer, and finally you get a resolution. You get to a point where your product or service has solved their problem. So as I said, it's the same story structure you find in a Hollywood blockbuster: crisis, catalyst, action, a struggle, and a resolution. And it's really useful to think about this when you're crafting your own pitch. Don't just go out there and say, listen, I have this, here's the price. Think about it in terms of a story. How does your product or service become a story in the mind of the person you're trying to sell to? So when Anthony Sullivan pitches something called the smart mop, he has a whole pitch in which the kitchen floor is suddenly covered in filth and ketchup. The usual cleaning methods don't work. You're struggling but failing to clean your kitchen floor. But arrive the smart mop, and Tony shimmies the chamois, and your problems are solved. But don't just sit there and watch. Call now. Resolve this. Make your own life easier, and be the hero in your family. The key to galvanizing your audience with a good story is to make the listener feel they can be heroic. When good salespeople prospect and pitch, they must be absolutely alert to the stories going through your customers' minds. What's their internal hero story? What do they want to achieve that day? What do they wish to achieve through what they're buying from you? Whom do they wish to impress? And what kind of person do they hope this sale will help them become? You're thinking about this all the time. What's going through your customer's mind? It isn't just a sale and an exchange of goods and services. It's a story going through your mind. What is it? It's also how you as a manager can manage your sales force. at Wynn Casinos, Steve Wynn, the big casino magnate in Vegas, he has a program called storytelling. And the idea is this, is that before each session, each shift, all the workers gather together before each shift with their manager, their floor managers. And the floor manager will ask all the maids, all the croupiers, all the waitresses, anyone got a story? They're the lowest ranks in the firm, the people who are dealing with customers and their immediate supervisors. Anything happened yesterday that's interesting. And one by one, the hands go up. So the way Steve Wynn describes it, one guy, a bellboy, mentions he saw a woman drop something from her purse as she went into her room. He saw it was her credit card. He picked it up, knocked on her door, and returned it to her. Another man was helping an elderly couple who'd just arrived and realized they'd left their medications at home 5 hours drive away. He tells them his brother lives a couple of hours from their house. Give them their address, call their housekeeper, tell them someone will be coming. The next morning, his brother has driven to Vegas, brought the medications, and they're with this old couple. These are now customers for life. For the employees at Wynn, it's a way of sharing what they've done. It turns them into kind of owners of the service that Wynn provides. It turns them into kind of heroes of the Wynn casino model. So the way Wynn puts it, he says every member of staff wants their story on the wall. Everyone goes to work looking for a story. He said it's pristine, it's simple, it's very effective, and he says it's changed the history of his business. No longer do managers have to keep an eye on all their employees. No longer do they have to think solely in terms of financial incentives. They can think about giving employees the chance to tell these stories, share their stories of how they provided excellent customer service, and it gives the employees a very deep sense of personal satisfaction. So stories, I would say, are the hard currency of sales. Salespeople need to tell them to customers. Salespeople need to have a story to tell about the work it is they do. And you must think about that as you're setting up business and selling yourself. The last thing I'd like to talk about very briefly is this idea of loose robes. And this man in the picture is a Moroccan rug and antique seller called Majid El Feni. And he has a store in the souk in Tangier. And he's a formidably successful businessman. His store is one of the most successful there. He sells rugs, lighting, jewelry all over North Africa, all over Europe. And he sits there, and tourists come into his shop, and they treat him poorly. He turns on the lights to them. They kind of ignore him. They don't know that he's a very successful businessman. They just think he's another carpet seller, one of dozens in the souk, in this marketplace, this ancient marketplace in Morocco. So I sat in the back of his office with him and asked him, I said, how do you cope? How do you cope with people treating you so badly? You must have your pride. And he flicked at the lapel of his jacket and he said, you're like a beggar in sales, asking again and again all day. My father used to say the salesman should have loose robes. Never get upset. Of course, sometimes you have customers and you want to kill them, but you're not allowed to. I think this is one of the most important things for salespeople to understand, and particularly people who are setting up their own business. Because if you're setting up your own business, you've probably achieved some measure of success in another field. Maybe you used to have an office, you used to have a title, you used to have a business card, you used to have benefits, you used to have all the perks that accrued to people working in large, comfortable organizations, and now suddenly you're on your own. People are looking at you in a different way. People who answered your phone maybe aren't answering your phone anymore because you're a startup entrepreneur now. You're not calling from the big company anymore. Being able to cope with that rejection, being able to cope with that position of being a beggar and finding a way to keep your ego whole and stay optimistic is absolutely vital. Another person I interviewed was a guy called Ted Leontis. He's a billionaire. He was formerly president of AOL. He owns large stakes in many of the major sports teams in Washington. He said to me that when he went on sales calls in the early days of AOL and they went badly, the same message would go through his head again and again and again. What's the worst that can happen? This was the way he rationalized it. Okay, a sale's gone badly, but what's the worst that can happen? I'm going to go very fast through this, and I hope these slides will be available for you to look at later and think about. But when I talked about why optimism is so vital in salespeople, here's a category. There's a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania called Martin Seligman, who's done all this research on pessimists and optimists. And he's looked at salespeople in the life insurance industry, and he's found again and again that it's the optimists who succeed. They respond very differently to a lost sale. When I talk about optimists, I'm not just talking about people with a big grin on their face, kind of irritating, happy people, but people who explain the events that occur to them in the correct way. So something happens to me, they lose a sale. They don't say, like the pessimist does, it's all my fault. They say, you know, I was made to rush. I wasn't at my best today. They say to themselves, you know what, this was the first time this has happened in a while. They don't say, God, this always happens to me. They look at their numbers over the past week and they say, you know, this isn't something that's always happening to me. It's an occasional thing. And they don't say, my whole life is like this, which is what the pessimists do. They say, it's just one sale. It's Ted Leonsis. What's the worst that can happen? They flick their lapel like Majid in the souk, and they say, you have to have loose roads. It's not just happy talk to say that optimists succeed better at sales. It's proven, it's absolutely true. You have to think about it in terms of who you hire and your own attitude to the inevitable rejections and failures. I like to call this attitude cheerful realism, which you identify any self-defeating thinking you may have or your salespeople have, reasons why they're being kind of irrationally pessimistic. You gather evidence around this. You find ways to distract yourself from negative thoughts, and you have to widen your social bandwidth. And this is an idea, and I won't go into it in great depth. I write a lot more about it in my book. But it's this idea that we think only certain kinds of behavior are acceptable. And as a result of this, we don't ask for money when we should. We don't make an emotional pitch because we're embarrassed to. And you have to think about what kind of behavior is permissible. When you're going from being, let's say, an accountant to a startup provider of accountancy services, you have to rethink how you approach business. When you go from being a driver to running your own fleet of taxis, you have to rethink how you're going to go out and get customers. It isn't enough now to just sit in the front of the car and make polite chit-chat. You have to figure out new ways of actually driving business and bringing in customers. Look for the happy losers. Again, look in your own heart as well as in those you hire. You want people who thrive on rejection, who when they face adversity and obstacles in their life, they don't get down, they enjoy it. One salesperson I met, he said to me this thing, I said, why do people in sales so enjoy rejection and failure? He said to me, Luke Skywalker doesn't need to be a Jedi, but we all pay $20 to sit on the edge of our seat and watch him become one. And it's this idea that great salespeople are looking for challenges in life. They're looking for obstacles. They're looking for reasons to kind of validate their strengths. So they see challenges in the way that a Marine might see a war. They see it as a way to prove themselves and demonstrate all that they've been trained to do. That's what a great salesperson has. They are happy when faced with great difficulty. I think this is why so many salespeople rather like this man. He's rather preposterous in many ways. He's got this silly hair, but he's succeeded, and he doesn't seem afraid. He says these things, think big and kick ass, but he's not afraid. He doesn't mind people ridiculing him, and he succeeds in spite of it all. I'll leave you one last thought and still have some time for questions, which is the greatest opportunities in selling are in areas of uncertainty. People often ask about the influence of technology on sales, and I always say the same thing, which is that technology has brought us a lot of information. So everyone has access to information they never had in the past. When you sell and you become a partner of your customer, the best thing you can do is guide them through the uncertainties that exist in their lives, in their business. They have problems they don't know how to solve. The opportunity in selling is to help solve them, to take that uncertainty and resolve it for people. So rather than shirking uncertainty, great salespeople should be seeking it out, because that's where the opportunity is. When everyone knows everything, find an area they don't know and guide them through it. We can all see prices online. We can all get so much information. We can see who's vice president here and there through LinkedIn and Facebook. So seek out those areas of darkness and obscurity and a lack of clarity. Seek out those problems that other people have shirked, they aren't trying to solve, and guide your customers through it. Again, here's my contact details. I'd be happy to take emails after today and answer them and help in any way I can. But I think we've got a few minutes for questions.
Philip, thank you so much. We do have several questions. The first question is it not crucial to believe in what you're selling?
I said that you have to believe in a wider range of things than your product. So let's say you're selling a bolt. Yes, you want to believe that your bolt is a good bolt and solves the right bolt problem, holds whatever needs to be held together. And I think that is vital. But I also think it's rational and logical to also think, when you're a salesperson, and if you want to succeed, is do you believe in the relationships you have? Is this a world that you believe in? Are these friendships you believe in? Do you believe in yourself as a credible salesperson of this product? Like, if you were the customer and you came through the door, are you credible in that respect? And so I think this issue of belief goes to the bigger issue of credibility, comfort, and a willingness to sell in hard situations. And most sales situations are difficult. So I think that's where it is. It creates optimism and credibility. I think that's what matters. But again, I think it has to be very broad. It can't be just, I believe passionately in the value of bolts or sweaters or garden hoses. It has to be a bigger set of beliefs than that.
Sort of a follow-on question to that is, as you were talking about the differences between servicing your customers and selling to your customers, the question is, are they not the same? Is servicing your customers not the same as selling to your customers?
Well, it goes to this issue of one-off sales versus relationship sales. So, in the first instance, when you've sold your customer a product, that's more of a transactional sale. Let's say it's happened quickly. So a car would be a good example, a simple example. Say I was going to buy a Honda Accord. The Honda dealership wants me to keep coming back to get my car fixed. And I think most people suspect that going to the dealership is more expensive than finding a good mechanic. So, enabling that relationship over time requires a very different kind of process. And I think you have to think about that in the first instance. So if you try and get all the money off the table, if you try and really maximize the financial opportunity in that initial sale at the expense of the long-term relationship, you've done something very particular there. And I think you need to think about that. So servicing, it is sales, but it's relationship sales. It's maintaining things over the long haul, whereas the initial sale is a transactional sale. It's all sales, but it's two very different kinds of sales.
Philip, the next question is, how do you get a meeting when someone keeps saying no to a simple meeting to start a relationship?
Well, I think, the hard thing here is that when you read a lot of sales, which you hear a lot of people, it's all this thing about the important thing is not to hear the no. Always try and turn that no into a yes. But there has to come a point where banging your head against that wall becomes a kind of insanity. And if someone really doesn't want that meeting, they're not going to want that meeting. Now, there are all kinds of tricks you can read about. People will say, I remember going to hear this guy, Jeff Gittimer, who's written the 13.5 Tricks of Selling. And he says, you call a customer up and leave a message that says, hi, I was just talking to your leading rival the other day, and they said, and then you hang the phone up. So it's kind of cute trick. They'll immediately call you back. But I think a lot of great sales is in the prospecting. You really need to understand why they're saying no, and not just coming back again and again and again and trying to bang your head against the wall again and again. Find out why they're saying no. Use the internet, use your contacts, put some context around that decision, and then come back to them. Because I think a lot of failures are a failure of prospecting. A lot of failures to get a meeting or failure in the meeting. It's a failure to do all the work up front to figure out what it is that customer needs. They're saying no for a reason which may have nothing to do with what you think it is.
Philip, the next question is a little more tactical. It asks, what additional training courses do you recommend for sales professionals, and do you recommend obtaining an MBA?
Do I recommend obtaining an MBA? Having done one and spent a lot of money on one, I have very strong views on this. I think you get an MBA, you have to be very sure about what it is you want to achieve. I think a lot of people go and get them, spend the money to get them, and don't really know why they've done it. They feel that in some big abstract way it'll help. And it's certainly true that in some businesses having an MBA really does kind of propel you through the ranks. But I think a lot of people can go and waste a lot of money getting an MBA, or what would be far more valuable is getting a very particular qualification, whether a CFA or whatever it is, that really matters to a business they're in. So if you really know what you want to do, and you really have a very clear idea of some specific skills you want to acquire, I would think first about acquiring those. And then if an MBA would be kind of additive and really helpful in addition to that, then I think about that. But I think it's a very individual by individual question. As to sales courses, I mean, there are so many one could take and one could do. But I think, again, as I said, when I went through those categories of breaking down a sale, so what is it that you really need to learn to do? Is it that you need to learn to be a better seducer, someone who goes into a room and really lights up your presentations? Then I would say pick a sales course that really helps you with that. If you need to be a better rationalizer, then I would say try and figure out the ways in which your customers analyze value. What do their spreadsheets look like? Really try and understand that. What I don't think is of great use are these sales courses that get you all sugared up. They are like drinking a can of Mountain Dew and you come out feeling great about yourself, but what happens 2 weeks later? I always say it's rather like diet and exercise. You know, it's very easy to watch a video, buy the tapes, buy the book, buy all the diet plans, and then within a week you're back to eating candy bars and burritos and not going running. So what you want is the course that's going to stick with you and that you can practice over the long haul. That's what you should be searching out and be very specific about the issues within yourself or within your salespeople that need fixing.
Bill, there are several more questions, but I'll ask one final one, and then I'll send you the rest, and maybe you can comment on them. But the final question is, if a prospective client already has a good relationship with a vendor, is it worth my time to try to sell to that client?
Absolutely. And the reason I'd say this is because you don't know what's going to happen in the future. Clients, in my experience, are always looking for options. If you're a buyer, the last thing you want is to be obliged to just one vendor. That's the nightmare scenario, because then your vendor controls your price, controls the way you manage your business. They're always looking for options. And I think you should, it's not dishonest, it's nothing of those things. You're presenting your customer with some options. And so when it comes time for them to decide to renew a contract, reinvent one of their systems, they now have choices. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable, I think it's decent, and I think it's what any good business persons would do, and I don't think you should be in the least bit squeamish about doing that.
Fantastic. Philip, thank you so much. This has been just a wonderful hour, and appreciate all your information. I want to thank all of the participants as well for joining us. These slides and the replay of this webcast will be available. We will be sending out a follow-up message with links to all of the important information that you need in order to get the slides and the replay. I do want to mention that our next Kauffman FastTrac Author Series event will take place on Wednesday, January 16th, 2013, if you can believe it. And it will be my personal honor to serve as your speaker for that event. I'll share some thoughts with you from my new book, which is called Coffee, Lunch, Coffee. It's a practical field guide for master networking, and I'm excited to tell you more about that. I hope you'll register to join me for that discussion. And in the meantime, please consider participating next week in Global Entrepreneurship Week. It will be the 5th annual Global Entrepreneurship Week powered by the Kauffman Foundation. You can learn more information about events going on all over the world at unleashingideas.com. And in the meantime, I want to wish everyone a joyous and meaningful holiday season, and we'll be back with you in the Kauffman FastTrac Author Series on January 16th. Have a wonderful day.